I am Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He's an author, of course, Forbes columnist, past UN correspondent, and TV producer. No other than Mr. Andy Samachuk. Welcome back, Mr. Andy. And as usual, can you please introduce yourself?
I'd love to, and thank you for having me back, Daniel. So, I'm a Canadian, I'm a lawyer, I'm an immigration lawyer, and I practice both Canadian but also US immigration. I was born in Canada, in Edmonton, Alberta, but I've spent half my life in Canada and half in the United States. Indeed, I went to high school in the United States in Los Angeles, and I've practiced law in Los Angeles for 10 years, in New York for 5 years, and currently I'm in Toronto practicing law at Pace Law Firm here in the city. I'm not only a lawyer, that is to say, a U.S. immigration lawyer, but I'm also very much interested in world affairs. I've worked at the United Nations. I write for Forbes as a someone who's a contributor. My articles have been read by over 1 million people on Forbes, as a matter of fact, and I've been writing for Forbes for about 10 years. In addition, I've written several books, and one of the books we're going to talk about is the book The Young Professional, which is a career guidebook for young people going into the professions. We'll talk about that, I gather, tonight.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you so much, Mr. Andy, for sharing your knowledge to the world. Speaking of being a lawyer, Mr. Andy and I have a collaboration to discuss about law. Please do tune in for our new podcast, and the title will be Law 101. We are empowering people or less fortunate people out there that cannot afford to, take law because they said, or can afford a lawyer because they said that ignorance of law is no excuse, no one. Right, Mr. Andy?
Yes, that's true.
So our aim here at Law 101 to give you knowledge, to empower you so that you can face the world with no fear. Ah, so Mr. Andy, the young professional, what is the main idea or theme of this book?
The Young Professional is a book to help young people who are going into the professions, and it is the result of something I noticed while I've worked with young people over the course of the years. I've helped over 10,000 people with various immigration problems. And in that period of time, in working with young people, I noticed that they have three predominant problems that they face. One or more of these three problems. And the problems are: number one, money; number
Yes.
two, time; and number three, balance. And so I decided I would write a book to help young people uh, who are entering the real world. And this is sort of a survival guide for these young, especially college graduates who are going into the workforce, but also for people who are new immigrants and come, let's say, to North America and are trying to integrate into the workforce, and also for people who have exited the workforce, for example, young mothers who may have had families and are now trying to get back into the workforce. So this book is helpful for all three of those types of people.
Yes, yes, the young professional. What message or takeaway do you want readers to gain from this book?
Okay, so I'm going to touch on every one of the three areas that I've identified. So let's start with money. How does a young person who wants to enter into the world of work present themselves to that world in a way in which will help them to earn money, to make something in terms of their income? And my approach to that subject is to ask the person concerned what is their unique ability, what thing that they can do would be the most useful for the world that they are entering, the career world that they're entering. Now, this idea comes in part from a funny origin. One day I was in a Chinese restaurant and I got a fortune cookie, and I opened the fortune cookie and it said, do one thing really, really well. And I think that's kind of a secret ingredient. It's the secret ingredient to succeed in the business world. And the ingredient is to ask yourself one of the key questions that philosophy poses for you. In terms of philosophy, there are two key questions to our lives on this earth. The first one is, who am I? And the second one is, why am I here? And in addressing this issue of income or money, I think we're addressing this question of who am I? And we're asking ourselves, what is it that's unique about me? And I believe that every person in the world is unique and has a unique ability, something that no other person has. I would call it a God given, unique ability. And the way I would describe it is that what the challenge is for people is to discover what is their God given, unique ability and put it into the service of others. And if they do so, they will become happy and wealthy and have a good life. Now, that's a challenge. It's not easy to figure out what is your unique ability. But the beauty of knowing it is you're working in an area that's of great interest and importance to you because it's your unique ability. It means you can work far better and stronger and with more passion than everybody else because of the uniqueness of the area involved. Now, to discover this unique ability, an example of how you would discover it is let's say we took you, Daniel, as a person, and I said to you, okay, well, what is your unique ability? And I said, listen, let's do this. Let's write out on a piece of paper your name, Daniel Lucas, and then let's list all the abilities that you have, all the skills and knowledge that you have down the piece of paper. And we might start with something like making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Number two, riding a bicycle. Number three, speaking English. Number four, whatever it is. And if we did that, after an hour or two or three, we would start kind of running into repetition of some of these things. Uh, and if you would agree with me on that, I think then we could uh, go to step two, which would be to categorize these abilities, these skills, into one of four categories. The first category might be incompetent. The second category might be competent. The third category might be excellent. The fourth category, unique ability. Now, if it was me and we were analyzing my skills, let's take one skill. For example, doing income taxes. If I had to categorize myself under those categories, I would say I'm incompetent. I know I'm incompetent. My accountant knows I'm incompetent. The income tax people know I'm incompetent, and pretty much anybody who deals with me knows I'm incompetent. But there are other things where I'm a little bit better. For example, making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, I'm pretty competent in that. Riding a bicycle, I'm pretty good. And in some things, I'm very good. If, for example, immigration law, I'm excellent at immigration law. But when it comes to unique ability, in my view, one of my strengths or one of my unique abilities is communication skills. I have good, indeed, I think I have great communication skills, not because I'm arrogant and I think I'm someone special, but I believe I have abilities that I've discovered that work with people and they seem to communicate with people well. So in your case, something similar. You might, I suspect, because you're doing these podcasts for free, that podcasting may be a unique ability that you have. And once we discover that unique ability and we put it into the service of others, that's when we will be rewarded by those who see that it's a unique ability and naturally want you to serve them in this way. And that's how you can work on the sort of wealth or income aspect of your life.
Very well said, Mr. Andy. Very well said. Can you tell us the writing process of the young professional?
Okay. Now, I mentioned also, in addition to unique sort of wealth and income, I talked about time and also about balance, but we can get into those a little later if need be. But about writing the young professional, as I mentioned earlier, this was something that happened because I noticed people were suffering with these various challenges. So I decided first, I wrote a few articles on the subjects that are in the book along these lines, on these themes. And then I decided, I should write a book on this, and hopefully it will help these young people. And I can show them through what I've learned how to cope with these challenges. And I decided to present the book in two parts. One part where is the sort of write up of what's needed, your resume, interviewing for jobs, articles about communication skills on the legal world, uh, finding a suitable career, etc. And the second part was the motivational part. In the motivational part, I came to the view that what I needed to present to people was uh, a larger and better picture for themselves than the picture they are holding currently of their life and their career. And if I could present to them a larger picture that would motivate or inspire them, then at the moment of motivation or the moment of inspiration, they might seize that picture and from that day on uh, work towards achieving the vision that they have, the larger vision of their lives. And that's what's happened with some people that have, bought the book and read it, and it helped them sort of in their careers going forward. That's the vision behind the book.
Yes, it served as a pattern for those young professional. So how did you structure the young professional?
Well, I talked to them along the lines of what I told you about, for example, in the area of income, and perhaps I could go on to the area of time, how to deal with time problems. So, in the area of time, what I talked about is this principle of 80/20. You may have heard of the 80/20 rule. The 80/20 rule came about from someone named Pareto, who was an economist in Italy uh, a couple of decades ago. He, in studying the Italian population, came to the realization that 20% of the population held 80% of the wealth. Another way of putting it was that 20% of the population made 80% of the income. And that rule, the 80/20 rule, became a way of seeing other problems or other situations in life that were useful for people. So, for example, 20% of the people in an organization are responsible for 80% of the result of the organization. Now, you can quibble with the percentages. It might be 10% and 90% or, different. But roughly speaking, it's 20% and 80%. And as we go along, that's, for example, in looking at an organization, another way of looking at it might be, for example, that 20% of the people who work in my firm, Pace Law Firm, make 80% of the revenue of the firm. Or, for example, 20% of the students in a school are responsible for 80% of the activities in the school. So, what that takes you to is the area of priorities. Time is a matter of priorities. There's not enough time for any of us to do everything we want to do in life. So the question is, if you want to be effective with respect to your time, that is to say, you want to spend your time in a meaningful way, you have to ask, what 20% of everything I can do in a day will give me the most results? That is to say, 80% of what I'm trying to get to. Now, there's another way of putting this, and this is the great breakthrough that I believe we can make in the area of time and in the area of the 80-20 rule. It's a breakthrough that a speaker named Jim Rohn shared with his audiences. He was a great speaker in America. He's passed on. But he put this formula in a different light when he said that this business of attaining what you want, this 80% that you're after, another way of putting it is there are only about 4 or 5, maybe 6 things that make the 80% difference in anything you're trying to do. So what are those 4 or 5 or maybe 6 things? It's a better way it's the same formula, but it's a better way of stating the formula. So for example, when you're talking about time, spending time, let's say, with your family instead of at work, you might ask yourself, well, what are the 4 or 5 things that are most important about spending time with my family? For example, birthdays, weddings, funerals, whatever they may be, or, wife, children, grandchildren, or whatever it might be. You might identify for yourself what are the key priorities for you. And by identifying those key priorities, you might say to yourself, I'm going to spend 80% of my time on these 4 or 5 or 6 areas, and then just devote 20% of my time to all the rest of the areas in my life. And by doing that, what you will do is you'll reorient your life and your activities and your energy, because in large measure, your life is basically energy. Where are you investing your energy? And if you reorient the priorities in your life so that you spend most of your energy and your time and your efforts into the 4 or 5 or 6 priority areas, you'll be doing what you should be doing with your life. And therefore, you'll be spending your time the way you should be spending your time. So that's when it comes to, advising young people, that's what I talk to them about in terms of the area of time. And then we go to the final area, which is balance. I know you would probably want to ask about that as well, right?
Yes.
Okay. So in dealing with balance, what you have to ask yourself is, for example, you, Daniel, we might ask, well, what are the areas of your life that are most important to you? What are the key dimensions of your life? Now, One way of looking at this might be to say things like, you could be philosophical about it. You could say, well, let's put it this way: physical is one area, mental is another area, emotional is another area, spiritual is another area. These might be one way of looking at life. Another way of looking at life might be to say things like work is one area, family is another area, recreation is another area, rest is another area, uh, travel is another area, or whatever it is. I cannot identify for you, Daniel, or for anybody who's listening or watching this program, what are the priority areas in your life or their lives. This is something that's completely in your control. You have to identify the values that we're going to be dealing with in terms of dealing with balance in your life. But I'll draw an example from my life to show you how we can balance the priorities that might go along. And in my case, let's just take, these broad areas, which may apply to many other people. So we want to talk about physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, I don't know, intellectual, right? These are areas that we could deal with. So let's take physical. So I'd like you to imagine a bicycle tire, and the spokes of a bicycle tire. So they reach out to all the circular wheel of the bicycle, these spokes. And let's imagine that each one of those spokes is an area. So, for example, the physical, we're going to have one of the spokes of the tires is the physical. And we're going to number the spoke from one at the center, two, three, four, five, out to 10 at the outer edge where the uh, rim of the bicycle tire is, 1 to 10. So that's the physical, 1 to 10. The second one might be emotional. We go from 1 to 10 on the emotional spoke. And then the third might be spiritual, 1 to 10 on the spiritual. And then intellectual, 1 to 10 on the intellectual. So when we have identified the important values in our life, according to that kind of a scenario, and I'm just using these ones as an example, but you might do something else. You might before I go on, you might choose for yourself, you know, you might like um, television, watching television as an example, sports, playing sports as an example, music as an whatever they are, you put them on these spokes. So what we do is let's take. I've taken the. I started with physical. How am I doing physically? Okay. So I judge myself. I ask myself, relative to a excellent physical condition, how well am I doing physically? And I might say physically, I'm doing, let's say, 7 out of 10. I'm doing pretty good. I'm not perfect, but I'm doing pretty well. Now I'll go, so I mark 7 on the spoke. And then we go on to the next spoke. And let's say it's mental. How am I doing? Intellectually, let's say, how am I doing? And let's say I'm very good at, reading books and thinking and everything like that. So I might put down 9 for intellectual, and then emotional, I might say, emotionally, maybe I'm doing less good. I might be only at 5, etc. Now these spokes make up like almost like a pie shape in terms of a circle, right? And what you would do is once you've gone through all the spokes and you've numbered the extent to which you're doing, how well you're doing on each value that you've identified, you can then connect the numbers by drawing a circle around the numbers. So from 7 to 9 to 5, etc., around in the circle. And when you've connected all those circles, all those numbers around in the wheel, you come to a picture of what your life is like. Now, if your life is balanced, the circle should look pretty much like the wheel. If your life is not balanced, it's going to look like a flat tire. Take as an example someone like uh, Van Gogh, the artist Van Gogh. Van Gogh was a genius. When it came to painting, he was spectacular. So he was 10 out of 10. But otherwise, his life was a disaster. Like his brother had to look after him and pay for his rent and food and all that stuff. He just did not look after his whole life. So, excuse me, in terms of the physical, the emotional, the spiritual or whatever, he just neglected these areas. So he was a flat tire. Now, you could say that for a while, you need to be a flat tire to achieve something extraordinary in your life. For example, in my case, to become a lawyer, I had to study law and I had to write bar exams. Now, when it came to writing bar exams, I couldn't be very well balanced in everything in my life because I had to spend a lot of time studying the books and learning the law. So I had to sacrifice, let's say, my emotional or my spiritual or my, those areas of my life to devote a lot of time to the intellectual and study aspect of my life. So I was a flat tire for, well, probably a year because wasn't paying attention to these other areas. That's okay if you know you're doing that for a higher purpose because you're trying to dedicate yourself to some achievement that you're after, such as in my case, passing the bar exams. Now, once I passed the bar exams, then I had to return to my balance issues and put my life back into balance. For example, I had to pay attention to my family, which maybe I didn't spend enough time on while I was practicing or preparing for the bar exam. And I had to pay more attention to, let's say, my income and my work, dedication to my work, and enjoyment and travel and things of that nature. So that's how that all comes together.
Very well said, Mr. Andy. Very well said. What will be your advice for those aspiring writers out there?
For aspiring writers, well, my advice would be this: number one, uh, if you are an aspiring writer, I encourage you to write. If you want to be a singer, sing. If you want to be an actor, act. If you want to be, a golfer, golf. Whatever you want, do it. Even if you're not good at it, do it. So, for example, in my life, I may have mentioned this to you before, Daniel, but I'll just share it again. When I went to university, um, I took a course called English 101. And unfortunately, I was not a good writer. I just didn't have it. I didn't have the skills. And the professor noticed that. And I had a hard time getting through English 101. In fact, if the professor who was teaching me knew today, and if he was still alive, that I'm a writer for Forbes and that I've written these books and so on, he would turn over in his grave if he's dead. He's dead, so he'd probably turn over in his grave. But back in those days when I was in university, I passed merely because the guy took pity on me, and if he knew that if I didn't pass his course, I couldn't continue in my studies at university. So I was pathetic. So I had to learn. And the way I learned is I wrote. I, I wrote articles and tried to publish them in newspapers and, periodicals and things like that. And, I spent many years writing. And over time, I got a little better and a little better. And over time, it became good enough that my articles started getting published in newspapers to the point where over time I became a UN correspondent, uh, you know, writing in New York at the United Nations, writing for a newspaper chain called Southern News Services. I know you live in Vancouver. I'm not sure, but I think the Vancouver Sun might have been a Southern newspaper. But across Canada, there was a chain of newspapers back then called the Southern News chain, newspaper chain. So I wrote for them, and I wrote for other newspaper chains in the United States and newspapers in the United States. And I spent a couple of years doing that. And then after doing that, I, I went back into practicing law, and I wrote little, things for my website and for Pace Law Firm and so on. And a colleague of mine here at Pace Law Firm named Sean Berry helped me by summarizing things that I would write and posting these things on various under various articles that were written about immigration. And and what happened was he posted some of my comments about Forbes articles. And one day, the one and only time in my whole life when actually someone contacted me about doing something, what happened was Forbes contacted me saying, "Hey, would you like to write about immigration for us?" Well, would I? Of course I would. And from that day on, I started writing for Forbes. So I would encourage other writers, people who are looking at writing, to write. And now it's not just write, you have to write and seek feedback to become better writers. It's not, practice does not make perfect. It's perfect practice makes perfect. And perfect practice means study and learning and improving yourself. Um, so, a way to improve, for example, is these days you can use Grammarly, which is a program in Word. You can use Grammarly, which helps you improve your writing um, by showing you how to correct everything you're writing. It underlines things that are not written well and tells you how to improve it. So I would use Grammarly, and you can use ChatGPT, for example, to come up with ideas. And an example would be you might write an article and you need a title. A title is important to an article. So a way of
Definitely.
getting a good title is to ask ChatGPT, here's my article. What are some of the good titles that you could suggest for publishing this article? And it will give you a list of titles that you can choose from to choose a good one for the article. Um, so, those are some examples of how you can become a better writer. But I would say the key example goes back to the issue of your unique ability. If you write about what's in your unique ability, so for example, if your interest is music, then you should write about music. And
Yes.
if your interest is sports, write about sports. If you write, if your interest is sports and you're writing about the stock market, you're never going to go very far with that. It really depends on you focusing on those things that you love and write about those things that you love.
Very well said, Mr. Andy, and thank you for sharing your talents to the world and, of course, your knowledge. And again, people, we're inviting you next week, our first episode with Mr. Andy. We're going to talk about law. People, let's empower people all over the world about law because ignorance of law is no excuse, no one. So, Mr. Andy, can you please invite our listeners to support all your books and, of course, your profession?
Yeah, you can get my books on Amazon. It's available. All my books are on Amazon. If you type in my name, Andy Semichuk, Semotiuk, in Amazon, you'll find my books, including The Young Professional that we talked about today.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Andy Samachuk because if you support him, more books to come. So, Mr. Andy, thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. See you next time.
Modicon people, see you soon. And Mr. Andy, book 101.